Serious, defense attorneys of Reddit, what is the worst offense you've ever had to defend? I'm a law clerk at a criminal defense firm. We take cases on appeal after the client has already pled guilty or been found guilty at trial. One of our clients is a convicted serial child molester, but some of the offenses occurred when he was a juvenile himself, under 17 in my state, which the law treats differently. I was tasked with going through the paperwork we received and figuring out which victims he molested when he was an adult, and which victims he molested when he was a juvenile, to calculate his correct punishment range. Problem is, the official court documents all name the victims with pseudonyms, John Doe, etc., while the police reports use their actual names. There is no legend or index in the file to tell me which victim is which, and it's cheaper for my bosses to pay me to figure it out than to force the government to turn over a list. So I had to match the child victims to their code names based on their biographical details and their accounts of the abuse. Attention, boss, child A is black, around age 9, and was touched around the genitals and anus with the defendant's fingers. Timmy Smith is black, and matches child A's time frame, but his report only mentions the defendant's tongue on his anus, not the fingers. There are no other black victims. I believe there is a 90% chance that child A is Timmy Smith. And so on. I am so glad that I will be moving into prosecution in a month or so. Defended an old guy/driver who hit and killed a mentally challenged girl who had run across 6 lanes of traffic against the signal. The guy did nothing wrong. The worst part about the situation was that we were being paid by the dead girl's family's insurance company, who the family was suing for benefits. So in my state, if you are in a relationship with someone or had been and you commit certain crimes, they get tagged as domestic violence. This tag gives additional penalties. Long story short, my client received a blow job from a girl and then hit her. We went to trial because the state wanted to say that one blowjob was a relationship and my guy didn't want to do the domestic violence classes. So we took it to the jury, who ruled that one blowjob isn't a relationship. I always have wondered how many blowjobs is a relationship. Posted elsewhere, but I defended a guy who sent poop through the mail to his ex-GF from state prison. I don't know how it got past prison officials, but it did, and he didn't deny sending it. However, we went to trial because he wanted me to argue that the poop was expressive speech, and thus protected by the First Amendment. We lost. TL, doctor, shit case, we lost. Although the offense itself wasn't particularly repugnant, I once had to defend someone who had been charged for driving with a suspended license because he was, quite honestly, in his and my opinion, on his way to an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting to prevent himself from drinking. He was a very serious alcoholic who had been convicted of impaired driving several times, and he had found that the only way he could stay sober was by attending AA meetings regularly. On this particular day, his license was suspended because of a prior conviction. He lived quite a distance outside of town, and his friend who typically drove him into town cancelled at the last minute. In a panic, worried that without attending the meeting he would relapse, and inevitably end up hurting someone else, quite possibly by driving impaired again, he drove his own vehicle, stone cold sober, into town. On the way, he was stopped by the police and charged with driving with a suspended license. In court, I wasn't sure whether to tell the judge that despite the delay on the roadside and the laying of a very serious additional criminal charge to this poor guy's history, he managed to call his AA sponsor, who picked him up on the side of the highway and drove him to the meeting just in time to arrive only a few minutes late, and stay sober for an additional 24 hours. Albeit with a reduced likelihood of the same positive outcome. On the sobriety front, the following day. Prior public defender. Child assault/sexual assaults are the worst. That aside, I once defended a very nice 80-ish-year-old man who had been married like 50 years, several kids, grandkids, and great-grandkids. He'd been charged with sexual acts with a horse. Turns out most of the community knew he'd been sexually interacting with livestock for many years and they'd usually look the other way, but I guess he went too far with the horse. He pled guilty to the felony but of course got no jail time. Worst had to be the gentleman who spent years raping his stepdaughter. He videotaped it, so we had to watch at trial. We knew the reason he insisted on going to trial because he wanted to see video again. Public defender here. I once represented an 11-year-old charged with forcible sodomy against another 11-year-old. You will often see kids charged with molesting other kids, but it's rare to get a juvenile defendant that young. Sometimes the parents are overreacting to two kids playing doctor, sometimes it's evidence that the kids themselves have been molested by an adult. Juvenile cases get complicated, juvenile sex cases get absurdly complicated. Between draconian laws that aren't really designed for juveniles, competency issues, how do you get a knowing, intelligent, and voluntary plea from a child? And moronic parents, it can get pretty overwhelming. Immigration law often intersects with criminal defense law, since having criminal convictions will get you banned from or kicked out of many countries. In my first year of practicing, I had to argue for a man convicted of molesting his young daughters to be allowed into my country, in order to help care for his disabled young step-granddaughter. Reading the details of what he did to his daughters, who were around the ages of 6 to 8, was horrifying. The now adult daughters wrote letters saying they'd forgiven him and had no problems trusting him around their own children. I just couldn't stop thinking that this guy was possibly going to be left alone with a little girl who couldn't move or talk, let alone defend herself from a convicted pedophile. Not that children should be expected to be able to defend themselves from a grown man. A weird one was a guy who had a felony conviction for threatening and planning to kill his previous attorney. He needed to clear up this issue because of a job opportunity in my country. He sent me this bizarre manifesto about the government's conspiracies to poison people via tap water, and how it was all the fault of the homosexual girly men in powerful positions. I was scared I'd be his next target, because he clearly had severe untreated mental health issues and all it would take was one lazy or sloppy border officer to let him slip through. Not worst in so much as it was serious, but worst as in, geez, do I really have to do this? One time I was trying to defend a guy that was alleged to have thrown his own piss in a woman's face. The kicker? The guy was an inmate and the woman was a guard at the prison, so it really takes things up a notch penalty-wise. Our defense? Her face tested positive for urea, a substance that is in human piss, but is also in an enormous variety of female beauty products. We had to basically argue that she put the piss on her own face through one of these products and they couldn't prove the defendant didn't just throw water on her. I mean, I feel bad for the guard. I wouldn't want someone to throw piss in my face. Public defender here. Matter of public record, still owe a duty of confidentiality, all that jazz. A client of our office was convicted of assault, defined as a non-consensual physical contact, with sexual motivation, the alleged victim being the 6-year-old niece of the defendant, making it also a crime of domestic violence. It's by far the darkest case I've been assigned. I can say, without reservation, that he got a fair shake. The summer after my first year in law school I worked in the public defender's office. Numerous attorneys had to defend clients who had allegedly sexually assaulted infants and toddlers. I guess in order to cope with doing that a lot of them made jokes out of it. I would hear somebody talking about a case and an attorney would say something like, "Yeah, but did you see how that baby was dressed? She was asking for it." I never knew how to feel about that. Horrible and distasteful, but they have to stand in court and represent those people. They can't get out of the case. I don't know, man. Okay, I'll pop in. Years ago there was a silent alarm that went off at the petting part of the zoo at about 3 a.m. Usually nothing, so the cops don't show up, lights flashing and guns blazing. So they're walking around taking a look and find a guy on a stool just going at it with a cow. Now this is one of the most unfortunate looking human beings you can imagine. Dude is hideous and honestly you kinda feel sorry for him and understand that the petting zoo is a logical place, in his mind, to find sexual partners. Cops arrest him and put him in holding. Because of the timing of it all, it was just before shift change, so every cop working in the precinct has to come by and laugh at the cow puffer. Then they tell the story to all the guys coming on shift, so they all go by and do the same thing. We got an initial hearing that morning, big city, and when I tell the judge that story, he throws out the case and tells the guy he's been punished enough by the embarrassment. Paralegal here, criminal defense. My first case was helping defend a father who raped his daughter since age 8 and promised her a puppy if she would let him stick it all the way in. After she turned 12, during an assembly in school entitled "Is Someone Hurting You? Tell Someone," she started crying and ran out of the assembly and finally told someone. She brought that 4-year-old dog with her to court as her support animal while giving her testimony because the father denied it until the end, despite DNA on sex toys and the victim identifying the specific porn sites. The father made her watch his computer and both their mixed DNA all over all of the furniture, in the bathroom, cushions, etc. They also had his computer from the pawn shop he hawked it at, and attempted to reinstall Windows, not knowing that the files are still there. The father worked in the Department of Corrections and told the daughter that daddy would get killed if she ever told anyone. That was my first case. Started drinking whiskey after that. Oh, so much whiskey. And started become desensitized to these effed up cases, so much so that I would laugh out loud at dinner events when answering, "So, what cases are you working on?" I could silence a dinner party in 5 seconds flat. He was found guilty and got 45 years. I quit as a paralegal after 6 months on the job. It started taking my soul. As I mentioned in an earlier comment, I'm not a defense attorney, but I did work briefly for the public defender's office during law school. While there, I was assigned to a prostitution case. My client was an Asian lady in her 60s who had resorted to selling her services on Backpage.net. Her business was quite lucrative, so she started pimping out a few other girls as well. My client didn't speak a word of English, or so I thought. So we brought in a translator to get the lowdown from the client. The next 30 minutes was the second most embarrassing and awkward experience in my life. Through a translator, she regaled me with the story of how she got into the business and how she had started pimping and her specialties in the trade. At one point, I'm even fairly certain she was trying to hit on me, but I digress. She told me about her ad that she had posted and how she had gotten a service call based on that ad, from the undercover cop. After a while, she needed to take a break, so I briefly scanned over the incident report that my colleague had just dropped off. Apparently, the officer arrived at the door, was forcefully yanked through the door by his shirt collar and offered anal sex. He noted that the only things in the hotel room were a 50-pack of condoms and a Costco-sized tub of Vaseline. Needless to say, we sought a plea bargain. The most embarrassing moment of my life came shortly after, when I had to walk her through her guilty plea and repeat in front of the judge and on the record the only English words she knew: $50 gets you anal. Copyright defense attorney here. Lots of people have been put through the ringer over BitTorrent downloads in the last few years. My favorite story is not from my client but from the same case. During one of the first civil BitTorrent file sharing cases, it became clear to me, and the plaintiff, that one defendant was lying. The guy had erased his hard drive to destroy evidence after receiving the discovery request for the computer. He then reinstalls Windows and names the drive Squeaky. He puts it into an encrypting USB enclosure and hands it over. It took them a while, but they figured it out. The guy got it with a $241,000 judgment for 5 downloads.